Hello, my quilting friends! My name is Leah Day, and welcome back to the Dream Big Quilt Along. This week, we're tackling our first ruler quilting design. I'm calling it Leaf Veins, and you're going to stitch it with both the mini slide or super slide rulers. So let's jump on the machine and learn how to get started stitching leaf veins in our petal shapes. So our first quilting design is leaf veins, and as you can see, it perfectly fills in these petal shapes. You can use either the mini slide or super slide rulers, and you can see you can do two different effects. I hope you can see this. When you space out the rulers and create kind of a closer spacing and then a further spacing, and you do that consistently, then you'll get kind of a pinstripe effect through your leaf. And then if you evenly space the lines, then you'll get this kind of effect. And it's really fun to just mix and match and play with this throughout your quilt. So I'm going to slide down, and I've decided to fill in this nice big leaf right here on the edge. And it is a little harder to do the inner petals. My best piece of advice for you is whenever you're stitching these lines and you have more of the quilt here in the arm of your machine, it's to try and line up your ruler so that your ruler is here on the outside of your machine, on the outside of the foot. That way you have plenty of space for it. It's a little bit harder whenever you have to have the ruler and the quilt all bulked up here in the arm of the machine. It's also hard for you to see what I'm doing if I tried to stitch that on video. So for that reason, do whatever you have to do. Usually it's just simply rotate the quilt around, and that way you can have the ruler always on that left-hand side. Okay, so I'm going to slide down, get in position, and we're going to start by bringing our thread up to the surface exactly where we want to start. We're going to start with that center stem. And I think for that, I'm going to begin with the super slide ruler. This is an extra long quilting ruler, and it's perfect for this because it'll set the stage for our center stem. And you can see I can space out down here and make sure that the tip of that stem is going to hit the tip of the leaf. So I like my ruler position. I'm going to drop my foot down, use the hand wheel to drop my needle down, bring it up, give that top thread a tug. That brings up a loop. That loop is my bobbin thread. Just grab a hold of it, tuck both thread tails right underneath the foot. There we go. That just keeps them out of the way. It stops them from making a mess on the back of the quilt too. There we go. Now my ruler's back in position. And what I'm doing is I'm just looking down here at the tip of the ruler and making sure that the edge of the ruler is a 1/4 inch away from the tip of that petal shape right there. That's where I want my stitching line to hit. And I'm spacing a 1/4 inch because, of course, this is a ruler foot. My needle is in the center position of a 1/2 inch circular foot. That means it's exactly a 1/4 inch spacing is what I'm going to be stitching. I'm going to stitch a 1/4 inch away here, and that's why I'm eyeballing a 1/4 inch from the end of that ruler. So it's all ready to go. And begin stitching slowly and carefully, just a nice steady speed. I like to produce fairly small stitches though, so if you like your stitches to be a little bit bigger, then maybe run your machine at a slower rate. Remember, if you have a speed slider on your machine, you can always use that to dial down on your speed if you need that. Okay, the big thing about the super slide ruler is it is quite large, and you will have to stop about halfway through and reposition your hand on it so that way the ruler doesn't slip. Now the big thing I want you to notice here is how wide apart my hands are, and also how I've spread out all of my fingers. That's to help me maintain really good control over the quilt and the ruler. So there is the first line of stitching done with rulers. Now let's double this line to create a nice vein line running down our petal shape. Now how you space this, you kind of have to think about it a minute whenever you're lining up with rulers. Just like I said, everything is a 1/4 inch spacing. So I want this line to taper, to go from a point down here on the end to about 1/2 inch spacing down here at the bottom. So what I'm going to do is line up the ruler so that right here I'm lined up right against the foot with the needle in the down position. That means I'm going to basically start stitching exactly where I am. And then the ruler from down here is lined up so that the line 1 from the edge, the etched line on the bottom of the ruler that's 1 from the edge, is lined up with the line I just stitched. And let me show you what happens when you line it up that way. As you run along that ruler, as you let it guide you, the lines are going to come to about 1/2 inch apart, and that's where they're going to stay. You're basically going to stitch 2 beautiful lines, roughly parallel, and about 1/2 inch apart. Isn't that cool? And that just came from this alignment. Down here, I'm lined up 1/4 inch from the tip of that, and down here, on this end, I had the line that was 1 from the edge of the ruler, an etched line on the ruler, lined up with the line of stitching. So here I had the 1/4 inch on the ruler plus the 1/4 inch on the foot, and that is what gave me this 1/2 inch spacing. Now, this is a little bit confusing, the spacing especially. It seems like there's a lot of math involved. There's really not. The biggest thing you want to focus in on is just kind of nudge your ruler over a little bit. Honestly, that's as easy as it gets. In this case, now I'm going to start the lines that are radiating out from that center vein line. And I want to line up the ruler something like this. And it really doesn't matter how you line it up. You could go like this with the curve going this way. You could go like this with the curve going like that. It's totally up to you. I think this is going to look really good. And like I said, it's not rocket science. You don't have to worry about it being exact, and as I said, just focus on nudging the ruler over a little bit if it seems too intimidating to think about exact spacing. Now, once I get to the edge of my petal, and this is the echo quilting that we did, I'm going to travel stitch over about 1/2 inch, and that's basically 1/4 inch from the edge of the foot to the line we just stitched. And you can see this here real closely. Here's the line I just finished stitching, and I just travel stitched up the edge of that petal on that echo line for our petal shape, and I'm about 1/2 inch away. Now I'm going to line up my ruler again. I think I'm going to kind of basically just echo that. I'm going to line up my ruler so that the etched line on the ruler is nicely lined up with the line I just stitched, the line of stitching. There we go. And in this case, it's a pulling motion. I'm pulling the quilt slightly towards me. And you can see 2 beautiful lines, evenly spaced apart. Now I'll travel stitch again, this time on that other petal shape. Again, I'm looking at that spacing between the ruler foot and the line of quilting from before. I line up my ruler. And sometimes, if you find you overshot it, don't worry about it. Just go with that new spacing. Lines further apart's not the end of the world. If you want closer spaced lines, then of course you'll want to be more careful about your travel stitching and bring those lines closer together, something like that. But you'll be able to quickly gauge, like as you really get into this and get used to stitching with rulers, you're going to be able to easily see when you hit that sweet spot right here, 1/4 inch from the edge of the foot to the line you just stitched. Right there, perfect. You'll be able to spot it. And then you stop, grab the ruler, use that as a guide. One more stitch maybe, that looks good. Okay, so at this stage you have a couple choices for where you can go. Basically both of them involve travel stitching. I can travel stitch up around this petal shape to reach my center stem and run along it, or I can travel stitch up the outer petal shape. I kind of like the idea of travel stitching up the outer petal shape. I think that'll look better. So you just begin stitching slow and carefully. And this is a time definitely, if you feel like you don't have control over your stitches and you want to go really slow, this is a time to use a speed slider in your machine to slow everything down. This looks great. Whenever the quilt feels awkward, whenever it just doesn't feel like you can push it evenly or easily, or when you can't see what you're doing, rotate it around. Give the whole quilt a move and shift, and then you'll be able to do better stitching. So I've swung the whole quilt around, and as you can see, I'm basically aiming to always keep the ruler, especially the super slide ruler, in my left hand. And this is not because I'm left-handed, it's because it's on the outside of the arm of my machine. Over here, it just feels a little bit more bulky and awkward. There's just less space here in order to navigate with this. So I just think this feels so much better to be on this side. There we go. That looks good. And you can kind of slide it around until some of the etched lines on the ruler actually match up with your stitching line. You might find that you have to take a couple stitches further down the line in order to get that to line up nicely. There we go. That looks great. Now I'm going to just pull. Actually, the motion here, I'm kind of pushing I'm pushing the quilt, I'm pushing the ruler, I'm pushing my hand, all of it, straight through the arm of the machine. There we go. Now I'm going to travel stitch on that center vein line, slow and steady, until the edge of the foot is about a 1/4 inch from that line of stitching from before. Grab my ruler again and kind of line this up as carefully as I can. Begin stitching slow and steady. That looks great. All right, so it's just a wash and repeat. As you can see, this line design is really, really simple. It's just a matter of stitching, of that careful travel stitching on the outer petal shape and then also on your stem, on your vein line. And it's also a matter of spacing out these lines as you radiate out. Here I'm spacing my lines exactly 1/2 inch apart, and as they line up, they really start to look beautiful because they're all running parallel. And the curve makes it even better. Of course, if you wanted to really mix it up, you could also stitch the lines radiating out from the center with a straight line ruler too. You could use the slice or ditcher ruler for that. So mix it up if you want to. That's definitely open to you. And you can create some really interesting effects. But I'm going to continue travel stitching along that center vein line. Slide my ruler in position. That looks good. Stitch up. Travel stitch some more. Stitch down. And I hope you can see just how fast this is filling too. Pretty much feel like that whole area is nicely filled. So now let's stitch the opposite side. And this can be a little bit tricky because before we were stitching basically from the bottom up and we're now up here. So the question is, do we stitch from the top down, positioning the ruler like this on the way down, or do we just break thread and return to the starting point? Well, this is a question that you can answer for yourself and just decide what's going to feel most comfortable for you. Personally, I think it looks really good to do some travel stitching along the stem, build up thread just a little bit more there. And if you had some travel stitching issues, like right here, I've got some travel stitching that's just a little bit off, we can throw more thread at it and make that hide in a couple different lines of thread, and then it'll look intentional. So let me show you how to do that. I'm travel stitching down. That's where I made my mistake. I'm just going to travel stitch back up real quick. I'm just throwing more thread at it. Rather than go in there and rip that mistake out, I just built it up a little bit, and now the whole line is going to stand out a little nicer, and it's going to look intentional. It doesn't look like a mistake anymore. Now, the one downside with doing this, I'll just be completely honest, it can get really addictive to travel stitch like crazy over every single line of stitching, and that is not good. That's going to end up wasting a lot of your time. So only do it when it's absolutely necessary, in small spaces where it just adds a little extra texture, a little extra interest to the quilt. Here you can see that actually looks really nice now, and it makes that center stem stand out that much better. And it also got us to where we needed to get in the quilt. So I'm just rotating things around and getting things ready to go for the next line of stitching. I do have a thread break that I'm going to deal with real quick. And I did mention in the intro video that this is something I do a lot. You can find a detailed tutorial on how I tie off and bury all of my thread tails at leahday.com/hide threads. Also, you can find the cheater needle that I use and the pen place to keep it handy. So this is just how I deal with all of my thread breaks. I don't build up thread in place. I don't do a globby thread method and then just cut my thread tail short. I actually tie them in a knot, pop them into a cheater needle, and bury them in the middle layer of the quilt. And that way I know that those thread tails are 100% secure, not going to come out, and you cannot tell that I had a thread break right there. You won't be able to see it, you won't be able to feel it. So that is why I do it that way. I really like that method. Alrighty, so now I'm going to travel stitch down, and we're going to begin branching out with more of our lines going in this direction. And there's many benefits to stitching that way, to going ahead and stitching down your line and getting back. You know, so I was up here, I could have started branching out with my lines this way, but then I would have had the ruler in my right hand, in the arm of the machine. It would have felt more awkward. I probably wouldn't have been able to space the design quite as nicely. This way, I can even start down here if I wanted to and work my way up, and I can really nicely space those designs. The ruler will feel easier to hold because it'll be my left hand out of the arm of the machine, so I won't have to worry about the bulk. I won't have to worry about fighting the quilt and the ruler at the same time. So for that reason, I think what I'll do is I'm going to initially kind of set the stage, set a foundation here with my line, and then I'll stitch back and fill in this little weird area here, and then I'll stitch forward. So that's the plan. And it's always good to just take a minute whenever you're working on anything and just take a second to stop and check in and come up with a game plan. Run your finger over it. You know, it's not cheating, and it will always save you time to do that little extra planning, to think about it just a little bit before you take the first stitch. So I travel stitched up the edge of that petal by 1/2 inch. You can see there's a 1/4 inch between the line and the edge of the ruler foot. That spacing, as you go through this quilt along, as you gain more experience with ruler quilting, that spacing is going to become so natural for you, you're not even going to have to think about it anymore. And it's so funny that that's just the way the ruler feet were designed. I think it was just a happy accident that manufacturers were making the feet on long arms. This is where ruler quilting came from long arm quilting, and they were making the feet big and bulky and exactly 1/2 inch in diameter. And quilters started pressing, making templates and stuff and pressing them up against the edge just to help guide the design and to help them have more control on their long arms. And then it just kind of went from there. And then a whole bunch of quilters decided to try it and see if it worked on a whole machine. My friend Amy Johnson, Amy's Free Motion Quilting Adventures, she's one of the first quilters to share, free motion quilting on a whole machine tutorials. And it really changed the whole game. It truly did. So I first stitched those 2 lines. Now I'm spacing out, stitching down. And if you're ever wondering, okay, do I have space for another line? Just line up your ruler, get it in position, and try and line up the edge lines on the ruler with the lines you've stitched. If it doesn't line up, then you know you need to stitch down a little further. Just take a couple more stitches and then line up the ruler again. Now if you've overshot it, that's okay. Just travel stitch back. It's not the end of the world. So here I'll take a stitch or 2 back, and then I'll stitch my line. Very good. Travel stitch down. The more time consuming thing, honestly, with this design is just that you have that good bit of travel stitching to do on the outer petal shape and also the stem, the vine line too. You have to do that very carefully, otherwise it can get messy. So slow and steady work as you do the travel stitching. I'm going to get back up here to the center stem, and then we can start quilting more of these lines. So got that weird area knocked out, and I know that this space here might look like it's a little bit big. You can see how big that space is, but when you put your ruler on it, you find that that's actually exactly 1/2 inch. It's not actually, I didn't leave anything open and weird there. It's just the way that it looks. If you ever have a space where you're like, oh, it just looks too open to me, go on ahead and stitch a line through it if you want to. That's a-okay. All right, so finishing up here, I think you can get the idea of how to stitch leaf veins. The big thing is ruler placement and spacing. I think it's absolutely key to hold the ruler in your left hand, no matter if you're left or right-handed, I should add. If you're quilting on a long arm, of course, you're going to hold the ruler in your non-dominant hand, and you're going to steer the machine and use the buttons with your dominant hand. That's just how it works on a long arm. Now, one thing you might want to know how to do is how to do that special spacing that I did in my other petal. And the key to that is using the edges of the rulers and the edge lines as a guide. So if I wanted to switch and do kind of a pinstripe effect, then I would travel stitch up that stem only 1/4 inch. So the edge of my foot over here is lined up with this line that I want to echo. Then I would line up the ruler so that I'm exactly lined up, so that the edge of the ruler is running along that stitching line. because whenever I do it this way, when the edge of the ruler is on top of the stitching line, well, I'm getting my spacing from the ruler foot. So I'm getting exactly a 1/4 inch spacing. So that's how I would stitch 1/4 inch space lines. And then the next line I would space wider. I do the regular 1/2 inch lines that we're doing right now. So that is stitching a 1/2 inch and putting a 1/2 inch between those lines. And that means that you line up the first etched line on the ruler with the line of stitching, and then that 1/4 plus the 1/4 of your foot equals a 1/2. So there we go. Just stitch that down. The actual quilting, the actual positioning of your ruler, all of that stays exactly the same. The thing you can play with is just how you position the ruler, how far apart those lines are spaced. If you want your quilt to finish really nice and soft, then consider 1/2 inch or 3/4 inch spacing of your lines. If you want your quilt to be more dense and intense, if you want that design to really stand out, then definitely space these out much closer together, a 1/4 inch apart, just using the edge of the ruler as a guide. And here's what it looks like when you finish quilting leaf veins in your Dream Big quilt. So that's it for this video. I hope you're excited about giving this design a try. If you'd like to know exactly where I stitched this design on the Dream Big quilt, come and check out the Dream Big Guidebook, available at leahday.com/dreamguide. I share step-by-step diagrams for which designs I stitch in which areas on the quilt, as well as extra helpful tips and tricks for getting started, and more instructions on what I'm doing with my Dream Big quilts. I'm going to be cutting these up and turning them into a quilted jacket. So if you'd like extra information, some tips and tricks and behind the scenes information, come and check out that guidebook at leahday.com/dreamguide. Until next time, let's go quilt.